chasing people is going to leave you more lonely than you were before. You have to realize that you shouldn't be debating or trying to convince people what you're worth. You have to kind of move in your own according. You have to know what you're worth and not really have anyone try to debate you on that. When we are trying to form these connections with people and people aren't seeing it, it's time for us to move on. It's time for us to realize that if this person isn't going to see it, it's not something that we have to repair or restore or build towards in the future. It's rather something we have to avoid. It's something that we have to leave alone. When you are, throwing yourself at these people, we can often see that it's kind of coming off as, being desperate. If we are being seen as desperate, then ultimately our value is going to diminish in this person's eyes. Instead of seeing, ourselves as such a low thing, we have to realize that we are valuable. And if anyone can't see that, then they can't have us. They shouldn't be able to even have the idea of being with us if they can't value who we are in reality first. Despite our potential or the things that we may attach ourselves with, that value is something that you get to determine. Your own perception of this thing will now, create it into the future. So when we do have our own value, it's going to be hard to convince people what we're worth. And I feel like so many people have this idea that chasing people, is so much less about what it actually is, but rather just your effort. So many people confuse, oh, I'm chasing this person by double texting, or this person is chasing me by doing this. When really, I feel like it's kind of just coming down to the level of effort you put into yourself versus the level of effort you're putting into people. If you chase your dreams, if you chase the things that were important to you as much as you chase these other people, do you feel like you'd actively have those things? It's so hard to look at the benefit and the obvious, profit you gain from chasing these people. But I feel like we kind of have to dumb it down. We have to water down this feeling and to realize that it's not going to help us in the end at all. We're letting people determine who we are as a person and letting them determine our value or worth. It's going to hurt us. Chasing people isn't something that we should be doing, nor should it be something that we kind of see now. I feel like ego has kind of affected that, the most point. When we are looking at not only other relationships, but the internet, we might see, oh, wow, this person is going all out, that's love, but other people can see it as chasing. Their own interpretation of chasing someone and basic, minimal bare effort has now become an issue. Just because you are texting someone every day or reaching out, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily chasing someone. It means that you're interested. And I feel like because of that, people are scared to be interested. People are scared to kind of actively show that they're invested in someone, that they want something out of this thing. And it's merely because of what they think the outside will think of them. The perceptions, the ideas, everything that goes into it, it's now inflated your own ego to where you won't step out of your way to find something. That's not chasing. That's just bare minimum effort. The bare minimum is now something that we have to focus on. Not everyone is going to be able to get that in a relationship. And we are looking at these things. A lot of people will see bare minimum as chasing, as being desperate. Well, really, that's what we have to have. If you aren't actively pursuing someone, how are you going to have a real relationship? We have to stop awarding this nonchalant feeling or awarding, being this cold-hearted person. But rather, we have to value having a big heart. We have to value that our ability to show this person so much love without this feeling of needing it to be reciprocated is exactly what sets us apart from so many other people. Our pride and ego may affect these things and even what we think about how other people will see us, but it's rather what we want in this relationship. How we want to make this other person feel is what we have to value from the start. That's something that not a lot of people are going to do because they're so scared of what other people might think, because they're so scared of, the influence this now has on this person or giving this person that level of ego. Well, really, it's just love at the end of the day. We are trying to love someone. So how are you going to do that without showing that love, freely, without showing it without any restraint? And I feel like when we are restraining that, when we are limiting the person, that we not only want to be, but the person we are, how are we going to, kind of experience any sort of love? I feel like that love, when we're trying to talk to people and we're trying to, open ourselves up and be more vulnerable, that is the most important thing. Vulnerability is the thing that I feel like so many people aren't willing to do. You want a relationship, but you aren't willing to do what you need to be in a relationship. And so many people don't really see that as a con when really it becomes that. It's something with a deeper meaning for a reason. How are you going to kind of have this end goal, have this award, have this product without paying a certain price for it? That price is something that you need to do. It's something that you kind of need to add on and need to restore. how are you going to want a relationship but not want to try, not want to give yourself freely and not want to kind of be vulnerable in that sense? That vulnerability is something that it's very scarce. And I know, you deal with, such harsh things, or you deal with being hurt, and that can now become a reason why you don't want to be open with someone. But I feel like if we're letting the past determine, how we act in the future, how we, see our future partner, not only is it unfair to them, but it's unfair to ourselves. That is more than anything letting the past affect your future. Just because I've dealt with this situation and I've felt this pain, now, I can make other people feel this way, when really that's not it at all. If you want to feel like there is love out there, why aren't you trying to be that love? You're letting your past determine, so much more. The people that let their past, be an excuse, you have to stop excusing it yourself for other people. You give so many people, so much more time and effort with that. Stop giving people excuses to be a bad person. Just because someone experienced something, negative, it doesn't mean that they can act a way, or act a certain way towards you. When you are trying to find something deeper and find that deeper meaning, I feel like that's something that keeps coming up. That's something that a lot of people kind of just ignore, and I feel like if we aren't holding people accountable, not only to change, but to become a better person, it's time to move on. And I feel like that restoration, that trying to build someone, to be something they're not, at the end of the day, is only going to hurt you more. When you're putting more effort into something that's not even returning, you have to realize that that's going to hurt you. That's going to be a reason to fall back. And I think that's something that we have to do from the start. Instead of falling back, a lot of times we're looking forward. We're trying to get this person to be something. When we're making excuses of other people, that's never going to help us in the future. Stop making excuses for the people that have harmed you. You look at their past, or you look at, this certain reason that they gave you to be a bad person, to not be held accountable. Well, really, we have to see that person for who they are as, in reality. Everyone experiences these things. And when you can't, become a better person after it, when you can't, face what happened and still try to be that love that you wish to receive, that says everything about your character. That says who you are as a person. And not only that, but who you want to be. These people that experience something negative and now use that as a reason or as an excuse, to kind of do these things to other people, that's not maturity at all. That's not something that you should even be around. That desperation in their own characters, to not really face what they care about and to face themselves, you have to be able to move on from it. You have to be able to see that this person isn't trying to improve at all. So why should you try to, to get them to be this person? Why should you try to kind of help them and to build them when they don't even want that themselves? Now you're taking more out of your own self, for this person, for making this person, better in a sense. And I feel like the whole basis of talking about chasing is not only about literally chasing, this person, emotionally, but I feel like it's also about chasing a feeling. When you're so scarce and you're not, given love, I feel like you kind of look for it in anything, and that can sometimes harm you. That can sometimes make you make decisions that aren't always for the best for you, but rather just because you want something temporary. Even when we know someone's not good for us in the long term, I feel like sometimes we just cling to them temporarily because it gives us a feeling. When you aren't fed love, on a silver spoon, you'll find it in anything. You'll look for it in anything. And that love isn't something that, isn't there. Love is everywhere. Don't get me wrong. But when you're forcing it, is it as genuine? That's something that you have to ask yourself. When you're not fed love on a silver spoon, you kind of lick it off knives. You look for anything and any reason to kind of find love in these people. Even when someone isn't good for you in the long run, you kind of find a temporary satisfaction in them. You kind of find something about them that makes you cling to them. Maybe you want to make this person, feel a certain way, or you want them to make you feel a certain way, when really it's just going to harm you in the end. If you know that this person isn't for you, if you know that this person isn't even capable, then why are you entertaining this idea? Why are you even setting yourself up for this failure? You're giving this person so much power over you because you have this idea of the potential, thing they can give you, when really that thing doesn't exist. That's something you fabricated in your own mind. There's a big difference between your infatuation with someone and even loving the idea of them. A lot of times you're not actively even chasing this person, but you're chasing a feeling. And you have to learn when to separate those things. You have to learn that you're not always looking for something, with this person. You're just looking for something to make you feel less miserable, make you feel even less lonely in that sense. And that lonely feeling strives from wanting to chase other people. And you have to heal from that. You have to accept that, and you have to know that chasing someone isn't a reason to, go out of your way, but it's more about healing yourself first. And if you're not healing yourself, I don't see why you would even, try to chase someone first. Why you would even think that it makes sense to kind of take yourself out of this spot and to kind of harm yourself. You have to stop doing that. You have to realize that, just because you want so much for other people, it doesn't always mean that they want that for themselves. And that includes, building them to be this person, or attaching this potential to their value now. Because that takes time. And that time and that decision to become a better person is something they have to make on their own. If you were able to make those strives for yourself, to preserve yourself, to become someone new, they have to find that too. You shouldn't be, dating people outside your emotional bracket, or even being unequally yoked in that sense. You have to have your own self, established in order to find someone established. And until you break that cycle, it simply won't happen. You have to chase yourself, not a feeling, not a person, but you have to chase that feeling of wanting to be you, wanting to experience that love, not with any, strings attached or with any conditions involved, but it's the love that you are capable of giving to others. Chase that. Chase something that you can tangibly feel, receive, and give. Instead of looking for these people that don't value it, or looking for this thing that might not ever come, be yourself. Be prominent in that character of knowing that you can do, whatever that thing is, and you're capable of it.